Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for joining me. It's 7th Great American History. It's Unit 3, Lesson 3. How much is too much? And right before our very eyes, we have got a Monopoly board. If you played Monopoly before, I hope you have, because, boy, that's going to help you moving through the rest of this unit. But here's the idea. We've got some people with significant control over entire industries during the 1880s and 1890s, giving the name Monopoly. And you know what? It's no game. Let's take a look at our introduction. Here it is. Big business. It's out of control. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Trust owned 90% of the oil industry and had wiped out most of its competitors. But capitalism and free enterprise were the backbone of the American society. How could the federal government regulate big businesses without crushing the spirit of capitalism? And who was strong enough to enforce the regulation? And you know what? What does capitalism mean anyway? We're going to try to define a lot of these things today. And so let's go ahead and take a look at where we're headed. We're talking about chapter 25 called Monopoly, not always a game. Of course, view the online lesson content. You'll walk through that student guide, and yes, you will have a quiz 3.03 titled How Much is Too Much? We're defining stuff today. We'll sneak in a little bit of information here and there. We're very much defining some economic terms, money terms, and some new phenomenon going on during these 1880s and 1890s. And it's going to cause some problems. So much of what we look at during this period is problems. Let's do it. Here are our questions. We got 3 driving questions. I'm actually going to kind of add to this just a little bit. So we're going to define some stuff. We're going to look at what is a monopoly, what is a trust. There's a little bit of a difference there. And also, what is a corporation? That's going to help us later. And also, we're going to talk about some economic types very briefly that will help you through the quiz and help us for the rest of the unit and the course. So let's start with the basic one because we're just going to touch on it and then we're going to leave it. So we're going to say, let's start with number 3. What is a corporation? This is going to help us later in the course, a little bit down the road here. So let's just go ahead and define it, and then we'll move on with the main topic, the main attraction. That is monopoly and trust. First, corporation. We get all these new business terms. Because business has been exploding over the course of the last 30 years or so. We're talking the American Civil War in 1865 ends, and after that, you have decades of explosive growth of cities, explosive growth of industries, and explosive growth of wealth in the hands of a handful. And history has treated these folks as robber barons and tycoons, pretty much meaning the same thing. The idea that these guys earned a heck of a lot of money, more than we could even imagine today in a lot of ways. And the people are starting to notice. What we have in this cartoon here is you have these heads of industries here, larger than life, richer than rich, and protecting their interests, while the people over here are saying, hey, where are the leftovers? Aren't we a part of this? Haven't we labored for you? Haven't we been a part of industry? Haven't we made all of this work in the first place? How are we going to iron all of this out? This is a significant theme that we'll be looking at. You have some characters that we're going to touch on here and we're going to come back to later. Andrew Carnegie of Carnegie Steel, self-made man, rises to some of the richest of the rich. He's not alone. We've got people like John D. Rockefeller, seen here as a young man to the left, as an older man to the right, of Standard Oil. An oil man, an oil company founder, otherwise known as John Rockefeller. Little 18th century or 19th century humor there, but really they called him Rockefeller. Get it? Okay. Anyway. I think it's kind of funny. And then you get people like this. J. Piermont Morgan, J.P. Morgan, he's a banker. And he's looking like he's not happy about it. But anyway, he's a banker. He's one of the most phenomenally wealthy people in the history of the United States, which is going to put him really in some of the most phenomenally wealthy people in the history of the world. Here's the deal with J.P. Morgan. He's a banker, right? An investment banker. So wealthy, not once but twice, he actually has to bail out the United States government when we get into some financial issues. Again, coming back to all this in later units and lessons. But here's an idea of how wealthy he was. You think, whenever we talk about these wealthy people in the 1890s, I think it's too easy to think, well, come on, we got billionaires now. What about like Jeff Bezos and Amazon? Or what about like the Microsoft people? Or what about Walmart or something? True, billionaires, lots of money. But think about this. JP Morgan, right here, at one point, if you added up all of the wealth, all of the assets, you call it, if you added it all up, he had more wealth than the entire northeast portion of the country. We're talking New England, the group of states we call New England. Not only that, he had 3 times the wealth of all of New England. Look at the American South. 13 states in the South. He had twice as much wealth as 13 states in the American South, and he had as much wealth as 22 states in the American West. No one has that kind of wealth today. In comparison, phenomenally rich, unheard of. So here we go. Let's define our terms. Corporation. First, kind of get this one out of the way, file it away for later in the lessons, but we want to know this. It's going to come into play, going to come into handy later. It is a business owned by many people called stockholders. That's the idea. We still have these today. That the idea is you buy stock in a company. You buy a tiny, tiny, tiny little slice of a company for a few dollars or a couple $100, maybe a couple $1,000, and you get to own a portion of it. We're not going to do a lot with this one today. We just got to define it and move on. We're introducing these business terms. Next, let's take a look at the one we're going to hang out on for a while, called Monopoly, where we get the game itself, the board game. Monopoly is this, and you're probably familiar with it. Whether or not you've played the game, you're probably familiar with it. Here's the idea. The idea is that a market that has only one seller of a product, for which there are no close substitutes, and the seller can influence the price of the product. In other words, and you know it, you've played the game, it's total control of an entire market or an entire industry. For instance, historically, we already mentioned John Rockefeller, the head of Standard Oil, owned 90% of the oil market. Pick a thing, pick a market, pick an industry, and pretend that you're the only one to sell that thing. Well, you've got yourself a monopoly. Nowadays, it's illegal. You're not allowed to have an entire market to yourself. You can't be the only person that sells iPhones. Well, that's a bad example. Forgive me. You can't be the only one who sells smartphones. Yeah, Apple can sell an iPhone. Forgive me. There needs to be competition. You can't be the only person that provides internet. You can't be the only company that makes cars. You can't be the only company that makes chocolate. I don't know. It doesn't matter what it is. If you are the only provider and you've dominated the entire industry and market, you have a monopoly. And these take off like crazy in this Gilded Age in the late 1880s and 1890s. And it gets out of control. Let's look at some examples. Or some cartoons, if you will, because cartoons are fantastic. This just gets after the idea that here's a man on top of an oil company. He's got an oil barrel, right? Lots and lots and lots of money. And what does he have in the palm of his hand? Well, first he has his product, oil for oil lamps. Kind of crazy to think that oil companies got unfathomably rich, not because of automobiles, folks, because we weren't doing all that yet, but because of lamps, because of lights. We weren't using electricity yet, and we weren't really using automobiles. It was about just simply lighting your home. Oil was about light and lamps. So he's got his product over here, and over here, you turn it around, he's got the world in the palm of his hands. No competition. That's monopoly. So secondly, we're going to take a look at Monopoly times 10. We call it a trust. When you're going to be reading through the chapters, you're going to be looking through student guides and stuff, you're going to see Monopoly and trust and Monopoly, and it feels like the same thing, and it kind of is, but it's even bigger. than a monopoly. A monopoly is just dominating one thing. A trust is a monopoly times 10, is when you put all these monopolies together and you have one massive beast that controls more than one industry. So, by definition, it's a form of monopoly in which many different companies in one industry are owned and run by the same people. It's like the people on top of the monopolies all came together and decided to, well, one trust to rule them all, right? The biggest example of this, the famous example of this, and I apologize for being a little bit fuzzy, is Standard Oil. Again, picking on John Rockefeller. Biggest example historically is Standard Oil, because not only do they dominate the entire oil industry, but they dominate and buy up other industries, like ones that aren't even really all that connected to Standard Oil. And so you have these octopus-like arms reaching out and grabbing on to American industries and economies throughout the country, like, gas companies, banks and finance, small oil companies, insurance companies, things that aren't even necessarily as related. Transportation isn't even on here. They own railroads and whatnot. It's a massive trust of monopolies. So hopefully you see the difference. Monopolies are kind of its own thing. You could monopolize any one of these industries, but once you've combined them all, you've got yourself a trust. Whew. And what does a trust do? Well, it blocks everybody from engaging in business. Here's the highway of competition, small businesses and whatnot, and you have this roadblock that is monopolistic trusts. Eliminating competition, eliminating small business, having entire control. And it's a threat to American business, American economy. Monopolies and trusts. And so we're going to look at a few cases. Like I said, I got to stick to defining terms today and kind of leave it alone, but I can't help but mention a few things. We'll come back to this one, but eventually, the United States government and laws and things, they kind of catch up a little bit and realize, this just isn't good. It's not sustainable. We can't do this long term. We have to kind of find a fix. And one of those fixes is going to be through laws. The most famous one of all is the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. It is anti-trusts. It's anti-massive, huge businesses that all come together and dominate and eliminate competition. So here's what it looks like. It's an act of Congress. It's a law, right? Made monopolies illegal for the first time. It forbade businesses from limiting competition, prohibited any contract, conspiracy, or combination of business interests from inhibiting foreign or interstate trade. So we have a law in the books that bans monopolies. However, in fact, I should go back. I shouldn't get to him yet. You're like, wait, what was this guy? No, we'll come back to it. Here's the idea. This, oddly enough, as important as this is going to be, it's not going to be that important for like 20 years, or even like 30 years. Here's a law that gets put in the books. There's some long history behind it as far as who wanted it, who didn't want it, and how controversial it was and wasn't. But honestly, at the time, it didn't do a whole lot. It was kind of a compromise. No one thought it was a huge deal at the time. Just, okay, let's make these things illegal and move on. They weren't really enforcing it. And honestly, in court, it was used to kind of put down labor movements and unions and all that. It didn't really work until 20 or 30 years later. It only started to work when it started to be enforced. Here is good old Theodore Roosevelt, TR. He's going to become president soon. We'll stay tuned later in the week. We'll talk about him further. But it didn't do a whole lot. This Sherman Antitrust Act is like huge in history because we say, oh yeah, monopolies are illegal now, and we used it to, prosecute all these massive businesses, and justice prevails. However, didn't work for a while. Kind of was ignored. No one thought it was a big deal, and then suddenly someone like TR is like, hey, We've got this law. Let's use it. Let's break them up. No mollycoddling here. I just like to say that. There's no wimps over here. No breaks. We're going to enforce the law and take out some trusts, oil trusts, railroad trusts, everything in general. Okay, we'll come back to all that. So lastly, to kind of push forward and wrap this thing up, I promise we got to define a few more terms. We got to come back to this as well. This is going to help us in the coming days. We got to talk about 3 different forms of economies. I know, we got to switch gears, but we'll keep it simple. Command, market, and hybrid. It's pretty straightforward, and the United States is always trying to balance this, these competing forces. In a command economy, you guessed it, the rules are being commanded. Economic system, which the government or another central administration regulates supplies or supply and prices. There's a centralized authority. There's a power. There's a control. It could be a government. Could be an individual person. Could be a system. But really, that's the bottom line: is that there is a force behind everything controlling it. Let's just stick with government. The opposite of this, what the United States has always stood for and tried to support and balance out, is a market economy. When the government isn't setting prices and terms and things, it's people. This is what capitalism is, which we hinted at the beginning of today. It's a system in which people earn wages, buy goods and services that we choose. We set prices, not a commander on the top of things. In a command economy, there is no individual or system controlling these things. It's about people. And lastly, and more practically in reality, and this is even the case today, in modern times, a little bit of both. A system where there's a combination, both command and market economies, also called mixed, hybrid. We'll dive into this later. But it is part of the lesson, so I want to sneak that in so you feel like you've got it under your belt. So here we go. To wrap it up, we looked at a few things. What is monopoly? What is a trust? What is a corporation? Here I will leave you with a cheat sheet right here. And you have this loaded into your lessons as well, into D2L. The definitions right before our eyes. So with that, I wanted to remind you that throughout this week anyway, there will be no exit ticket. That's for free. You're welcome. Don't worry about it. It is not a requirement for the week. I'll leave this here. Thank you, everybody, for joining me. Have a fantastic week. I will see you soon. Bye, folks. Thank you again.